Hi, King Dan here. This video is called Kingship Relativism 101. You know you're a libertarian when both sides get triggered by using the same logic, standards, and same arguments. In this case, both sides say that elements of True Father's mission were left incomplete. But what that does is it opens up an avenue of relativism with another member of True Family. And then they get really upset and insulted when you point that out. So I can honestly say that I have and fully accept, the dozen quotes that Father said to support Hyung Jin Moon. No issues with them at all. I just don't dismiss all of Father's other words in the process. All right, my personal context. Before we begin, I wanted to kind of set this stage up front to know where I'm coming from. All right, absolute standards. Adam, Jesus, and Hyung Jin Moon are or were singularly unique. Clearly, Adam didn't make it, and Jesus was never able to bring the marriage blessing to humanity. So Hyung Jin Moon, as True Father, represents that singularly unique original ancestor that we all can engraft onto. Now, God sets the standards that are established through Christ and True Father. Because True Father comes, the moral, the sexual, the legal standards all are established by God through True Father. So True Father ends up being this representative of God. However, the next line, True Father's children each have their own personal, direct, divine relationship with God. It's a personal relationship, and it doesn't actually go through anyone like my parents or a successor or a pope. You have your own personal relationship with God, and we have True Father to thank for that. All right, natural law. An easy example of natural law is, can the time of sunrise or sunset be changed if it's accepted by the people, passed by Congress, signed by the president, and upheld by the Supreme Court? No. Natural law exists whether you like it or not. So there are natural limitations found within the principle. For instance, you cannot have freedom without first having, staying within the principle, having achievements, and having responsibility. As soon as you break freedom and responsibility, you're actually entering a potentially unprincipled situation. That's natural law. So an example of this one is the words of any successor cannot override True Father. True Father sets the standard that every other child of God has to submit to, because there's actually freedom in submitting to Father's standards. All right, before you get triggered, just bear with me for a second. Can, even though a successor is given the full authority of true parents, which, by the way, all blessed families do, unless you believe in relativism, can the successor change the divine principle? Can the successor change the Cheongseongyang? Can the successor change True Father's traditions? Okay, so this is what I'm pointing to. The answer is obviously no. Father sets those standards, and it's us to try to honor them. All right, so if there's a conflict between True Father's words and any blessed family, successor, kingship, mother, doesn't matter. If there's a conflict, do you stay true and adhere to Father's words or the successors? All right, to me, there's an obvious answer to a really silly question, but I'm unfortunately a little insecure about the types of responses that we'll get. Maybe verbally it'll be one way, but actually culturally it'll be different. And that was what was exposed during the Jamal vs. Lourdes case. All right, so Jamal vs. Lourdes. I'm not going to get into this. You can watch the whole series I made based on the actual facts of the case. But what at its core, it exposed the relativistic perspective of the kingship culture. Okay, let me explain. It exposed the culture of equating the representative kingship's words, culture, and will as True Father's words, culture, and will. It also exposed the culture where the direct heir somehow, it's relativistic, somehow has unique responsibilities, civil rights, or a special mission. This pattern is actually exactly the same as Family Fed. What Family Fed does is they change father's words with mother's, and around Hyunjinim, with Hyunjinim, it's the same. He changes father's words with his son. An easy way to point this out, and you can see this, is when someone is justifying the actions of Hyunjinim, right? If Hyunjinim honors father's traditions, people are like, oh, look at that. He's honoring father's traditions. But then if he changes father's traditions, oh, look at that. He was guided by father. So it doesn't actually matter what Hyunjinim is doing. People around Hyunjinim will justify that as father's will. But when I go back to father's words, there are some very clear differences. All right, cultural relativism. Before I begin, I just want to say these are older words from the very beginning, several years ago, and I'm happy to be wrong. But at least I'm making an argument, and at least you can pay attention to what I'm trying to point to in a cultural sense, right? Follow your conscience and father's words to you. Don't follow me, don't follow another human being, right? But what I want to point to is what actor in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3, actually wants to change father's words in context, or God's words in context. And I can't spend 5 minutes for each one, or we'll be here all day, and I don't particularly want to be here all day either. So the first word is kingdom, or Chungaguk. There is a difference between the biblical kingdom within you and the political archangelic kingdom that's being heavily pushed by Kukjin. So basically, it's switching the focus from the people to the government. It's switching the focus from the children of God to the archangel, right? And then it's taking the archangelic perspective, which is a valid perspective, but then using that as what the biblical kingdom, and overriding the biblical kingdom. They're two very different things. The biblical kingdom, Chungaguk, is where two become one. It's a nation of absolute sex. The archangelic kingdom, from a political perspective, doesn't have any right to interfere with the body of a prostitute. However, a prostitute will never be able to enter the biblical kingdom until he or she then makes that personal transformation through the marriage blessing to become a citizen of Chungaguk, right? It's a very clear delineation between what your focus is. I want to focus on father's meaning of Chungaguk, not Kukjin's. Wilderness. When I read Revelations 12 and 13, it comes across as more of a literal context, right? It's figuratively speaking, but the how it played out was more literal, right? An actual wilderness, being kicked out of your own home. But there's another context of where it's being talked about as the wandering Israelites, right? The period of the wilderness between Egypt and before entering Canaan. But that begs a secondary cultural question that needs to be answered. Are we in the period of settlement, or are we still in the providence of restoration? When I read Father's words, he says we're in the era after the coming of heaven. Everything is accomplished. It's the period of natural submission of Satan. Okay? That means we're standing in our own crown. When I see the culture around Hyunjinim, it's still a restoration. Han Mother failed. We need to recreate Father's course. So they basically going back to the old wineskin of the wandering Israelites. They haven't entered Canaan in their own mind. Okay, this is, you have to know your own mind here. So just know the difference. For me, I'm going to stand in the victory of being in the era after the settlement of heaven, after the coming of heaven. Sanctuary. I've been reading a lot of Father's words about his vision of Family Fed. So this one in particular, back in the very, very beginning, Hyunjin was like, he says, Father gave me a scroll and had world peace unification sanctuary, right? So they take the words, and there's difference in meaning of the word sanctuary here. Is it a safe place for brothers and sisters to avoid and be at peace away from the reversal of dominion of archangelic institutions, people, for instance? Or, just like what I'm seeing with Family Fed, do they take Father's words and turn it into an archangelic structure or an organization? And I don't have any problem with organizations at all. You're never going to be away from an organization. It's always going to have structures. So, but is this a realm of protection for the children of God? Or are you being turned into organizational salesmen, right? There is a big difference here. And in one environment, you're just being pushed. You're the means to someone else's end. And if you are a child of God in a place of sanctuary, you are actually the end itself, because it's about the relationships of brothers and sisters versus the agenda given to you by someone else. All right, kingship. This one is heavily relativized. So when I read Father's words, Father always says that basically it's God, Father, you. Sometimes he goes grandfather, Father, you. But it's always about you. You're the center of the cosmos, okay? You're the one who has a direct relationship with God. But around Hyung Jin, it's basically only ever referred to as Father Hyung Jin Shinjun. Okay? So, and then here it's like the second king, the second king, the second king. Really? But that's relativizing Father's kingship as he defines it. I'm not taking away Hyung Jin's crown here. I'm just not monopolizing that crown for something that Father didn't actually mean. That meaning is broader to mean Father, God, and then you in your kingship. In that context, actually, Hyung Jin would be third king. So every time you hear the word second king, just be aware they're pushing a relativistic, monopolistic perspective of kingship. All right, so inheritance, lineage versus the organizations. At first, it made a lot of sense where everyone was returning to Father's authority, and Hyung Jin was crowned by Father, and Family Fed basically was taken away from him, and that was his inheritance. But then you really get to think about it, and you read Father's words. That doesn't really hold up. When I read Father's words, he's saying things like, there's nothing in his name. He doesn't own anything. Okay, so Family Fed was never his. Actually, it was the first beast. Why would you even want that back? So, and then I do read Father's words on inheritance. He says every child of God receives an inheritance, right? And what is the inheritance in that context, right? It's the inheritance of lineage and basically having dominion over creation. It has nothing to do with this very carnal perspective of receiving an inheritance. In fact, it's like there's a sense of entitlement and victimhood that he didn't get the power of Family Fed. No, I'm very grateful he was able to leave. I'm not taking any of that away. I'm just pointing to a very, very important distinction between inheritance and lineage versus inheritance and really more external things. All right, sovereignty. Jamal Johnson versus Tim Elder. Basically, Jamal Johnson presented a principled perspective of, inheriting sovereignty as a result of lineage. And then Tim Elder really pushes this we're not sovereign mentality. And that comes from Cookshim's real perspective where sovereignty comes from the barrel of a gun, which is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous just to think like that means Jesus wasn't sovereign on the mount over Satan, right? And then Father, when Satan was defeated in the late 90s, he wasn't carrying around a gun. So it's a difference in the meaning of sovereignty and whether or not you think it's restored or not. I'm not going to get into it anymore other than to say that sovereignty is a result of lineage, basically, and that Father said it's already restored, contrary to the naysayers that we need sovereignty, we need citizenry, we need territory. All that's restored if you believe Father's words. There's a discussion related to sovereignty in the June 17, 2017 King's Report between Jamal Johnson and Tim Elder. It starts around an hour and 28 minutes in and goes for about 20 minutes, but it really shows you the difference in this perspective. Heir, representative, or fourth Adam. When I read Father's words, and he's using these words around the time period he did crown Hyung Jin, right? he did say Hyung Jin Moon was his heir and representative. But that whole time period, he was giving tons of speeches where he's saying all his children are his heirs and representatives, especially you. So this relativistic culture reinforces it and really prioritizes Hyung Jin Moon as, father's heir and representative. It's actually the same problem that happens with the kingship, right? The three great kingships or the three-generation kingships. It monopolizes father's words and, in fact, takes away implicitly your crown and your position as heir representative in fourth Adam with your own direct personal relationship with God and true Father. Tribal messiahship. Do you connect people to God, or do you connect people to Hyung Jin Moon? All right, this is a really important one. I remember a Q&A with Kukjin maybe 2 years ago. I don't really remember. I really feel sorry for this lady, but she was probably from an island nation in the Philippines, Singapore, something like that. And she was, pushing back to Kukjin a little bit, and he was saying, but what about tribal messiahship? And he basically scolded her and saying, that's the problem with you first generation. You don't take Father's words, and you don't do Father's words. You want to change it. The whole point, though, is I think that was actually him changing Father's words. When I read tribal messiahship, I don't see any means that you have to bring people and connect people to Hyung Jin Moon, which is what he was saying. Right? He was saying tribal messiahs are basically organizational salesmen to bring people to Hyung Jin Moon, and then Hyung Jin Moon will bring people to God. Right? But that's not God's version of tribal messiahship. As a tribal messiah, including Hyung Jin Moon, as a tribal messiah, you represent Father wherever you go. You can give the blessing because Father told you. In fact, I read a speech that Father said, all Unification Church blessed families are in the position of Lord of the Second Advent. That's crazy, or that's true. You have to decide whether you are bringing people to Hyung Jin Moon or you're the representative of God. Next is True Cain, Kukjin Moon versus Hyung Jin Preston Moon. So it's obvious that True Father crowned Kukjin Moon the true Cain. But I've even been around Kukjin several times, and he'll say verbally it's really Preston that's the true Cain. But I don't know that I agree with that. Sure, Preston has issues. He likes to pick and choose which words of Father he wants to accept. Family Fed does the same thing. But Kukjin's actually behind a lot of this cultural change around Hyung Jin Moon too. To me, it's perfectly clear that Kukjin is the true Cain. And I'm glad Father agrees with that. I just wonder what other things that Father said about the unity of the two brothers. Last one is Rod of Iron, Christ, Truth versus AR-15 and the whole guns, firearms, what have you, just the entire topic. So if you read the divine principle defines the rod of iron as Christ and the truth. Okay, it has nothing to do with a firearms culture. It has everything to do with the relationship and engrafting to the lineage and the relationship of God and truth through Christ. Okay, so you actually have to check yourself and check the justifications on why you're willing to relativize the meaning of rod of iron and all the things that Hyung Jin Moon says relates to the rod of iron. And just check that motivation, check that reasoning, because it's relativistic, right? I'm not trying to be mean about this, but you can't change Father's definitions like you can't change Father's kingdom. So the rod of iron kingdom has nothing to do with Father's rod of iron and Father's perspective on Changaguk, or the kingdom, if you actually are staying true to Father's words. All right, so if I'm right about any of these words and any of these definitions, then the culture is actually missing really something quite severe in your amygdala function to accept a false definition, false culture around those false definitions. So Hyung Jin may not believe in relativism, but if I'm right on any of them, he's practicing it all the time. But don't believe me. Like, seriously, don't believe what I say. Go back and read Father's words, pray about it yourself, follow your own conscience, come to your own conclusions based on Father's absolute truths, not the cultural relativism that I'm trying to point to. Points to ponder. It's really unfortunate that so many people were willing and very sacrificial to walk away from one relativistic culture, family fed with mother, only to turn around and accept everything that they've heard from Hyung Jin, Kook Jin, kind of everyone else, and then accept that without realizing that that itself is just another relativistic culture where there's a living truth, if you believe Kook Jin's version of Hyung Jin. I can't do that. So here's questions that I have to grapple with, and spend a week on each question. Is it possible to relativize true father with his crowned successor? Does following Hyung Jin Moon directly equate to following true father? Are the king's rulings divine truth or simply personal opinions? What are the natural limitations to the full authority of true parents? Can Hyung Jin Moon invalidate a sexual union previously ordained by true parents? Can a successor be or become the greatest distraction to Heavenly Father? What mindset leads one to believe a crowned successor knows God better than you? And is the kingdom culture based on relativizing Father's definitions? And is Hyung Jin Moon practicing a culture or theology he preaches against? I know people who don't know me are going to be thinking, oh, you're just being very disrespectful. I can imagine a whole bunch of Asians thinking that, which isn't true at all. I'm really trying to point to, am I crazy in seeing something? Or is there something that I'm seeing that I actually have the responsibility to point out? If there's one person I believe that can go Buddha and leave behind the vain palace luxuries, I think True Father chose well in choosing Hyung Jin. In fact, he's already done it once.